Hello YouTube, my name is Brendan Anderson, I'm the film critic for the blog Here's Looking at You Kid, and today I'm going to be starting to review classic horror films. The reason being, it's October and that's a great time to watch these movies. We're going to start right now in sort of the black and white classic films from the 30s and 40s. We'll do some early Universal monster movies like Dracula and Frankenstein, but today we're going to start with the Val Lewton horror films that were made in the 1940s. Now, a lot of times these classic horror movies, when you look back on them, are not very scary, understandably. They were scary at the time, but not necessarily, like the horror films that we are scared by today. But these films do have some great atmosphere, great direction, great acting, and in some cases, they are a little bit chilling. So we're going to go through them, and because it's October, and it's going to be a long series of videos that will eventually lead up to some more modern, you could say, scarier films. So Val Lewton was actually not a director, who I usually talk about directors or actors when I'm reviewing a movie, but Val Lewton was a producer, and he was a producer for RKO Radio Pictures. Now, if you don't know a lot about classic movies, you may not know what RKO Radio Pictures is, and that would be completely understandable, because they don't exist anymore. Unlike Warner Brothers or MGM, who still have production companies and distribution centers for movies, we still know Warner Brothers movies and we still know MGM. RKO went bankrupt, unlike those other studios. And the reason being, the seeds for their bankruptcy were actually sown all the way back in the early 40s when they hired the young prodigy Orson Welles to direct some films. They put him under contract, but instead of the typical director contract where the studio had a lot of control over budgetary means and actors and things like that, they gave Welles carte blanche to make whatever he wanted to make. And in some cases, that gave us some great critical successes. Many critics consider Citizen Kane to be the peak of the American filmmaking. But in many cases, it also didn't turn into a lot of box office receipts. Partially because Welles' Citizen Kane was very controversial, and there was a battle with William Randolph Hearst over the release of the film. But also partially because it wasn't also that popular. It wasn't like an entertaining movie. So, in the sense of it wasn't entertainment like a musical or a detective film. And in that case, it didn't make a ton of money. And what happened is RKO really never was able to recoup on that. It would be one thing if it was just Citizen Kane, but Welles' next project, The Magnificent Ambersons, was also ridiculously expensive. And unfortunately, that also didn't get released in its full form. It didn't get enough box office receipts, and they ended up losing money on that. So two huge losses eventually led to RKO's bankruptcy. In between the time when RKO made Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, and towards the end of its run as a studio, they needed to do a lot of movies that wouldn't cost a lot of money, but would make a lot of box office receipts. And they hired, they were looking and searching for a producer to make these horror films. And, well, at first they were just trying to decide what genre to do. And they figured that they would get into they'd already done some of the detective adventure stuff. And they figured, why not try what Universal used to do, and what they're actually resurrecting now, and do some horror movies, because Universal originally had been very successful with Dracula and Frankenstein, then they had taken a break, and then starting with, like, The Wolfman in 1941, Universal found that horror also, again, was a huge moneymaker. So RKO's like, yeah, let's look at horror as a possible way to make money. So again, at one of these classic Hollywood parties, they're on this search for a producer, and some guy turns to another and says, hey, look over there, it's Val Lewton. He writes horrible novels. Well, the guy who this man turned to was actually an RKO producer, and he, of course, was looking for a guy who wrote horror books, and he thought that when the man was saying horrible novels, he was actually saying horror novels. And so he went over to Val Lewton and immediately hired him as the director, as the producer for their horror unit. Val Lewton kind of has an interesting backstory in that he has claimed that he shot part of the sequence, directed part of the sequence in Gone with the Wind with all the dead soldiers. He had a lot of things that he did around Hollywood, and he was a very educated, very well-versed guy, and he was now struck with this task of making this horror production unit. and the studio said that they were going to tell him what the movie titles had to be, and he had to come up with the horror movies. So he thought, okay, that'll be fine, but then he got the first title, and the first title that he got was Cat People, which, admittedly, is a very lurid title. Very hard to deal with. For a guy who's super educated, he wasn't looking to make some sort of terrible movies. He wanted to make high-quality films, and he was stuck with this title of Cat People. And that is our first review today. It is Cat People from 1942. Cat People is a film that people go into watching it today with ridiculously low expectations. I remember watching The Essentials on TCM once, and it was the first time I saw this film. Robert Osborne considered Cat People one of the essentials, meaning one of those classic movies that you had to see. And Alec Baldwin, who at that time was co-hosting The Essentials, wasn't so sure about it. And the reason being, I mean, Cat People is a 1942 low-budget horror film whose male lead is played by a guy named Kent Smith. I mean, it doesn't look like a movie that would be in any way great, let alone even good. I mean, the idea of people turning into cats just seems bad, like a werewolf thing. It doesn't sound good, no matter what. Well, what's weird about Cat People is that not only is it good, it's great. And part of the reason being is it's Val Lewton. And Val Lewton had this thought that he wanted to take these titles that he got that were so terrible and turn them into something quite good. And Cat People is, in fact, something quite good. One thing that you're immediately struck with about Cat People is from the opening of the movie, you're like, where is the monster? Where is the werewolf? I mean, because you're expecting someone to suddenly turn into a cat and start eating people and stuff. What you realize, as far as you get halfway, even halfway into the film, what you realize is it's actually a movie that's about so much more than just a werewolf, and it's not even about a werewolf. It's about a woman and her psyche, and what has haunted her, and how these stories of these people who turned into cats in her village have really haunted her for the rest of her life. It's really ambiguous as to whether she actually even turns into a cat, or whether she just imagines herself to being a cat. You know, we do see typical acts of werewolfism, but we never really see anything in full view. We never see her actually transform into a cat. This was a work of sheer brilliance by Val Lewton, because it could have just been so terribly cheesy if we saw this woman turning into a cat. Like, I like Lon Chaney Jr. in the original Wolfman, which is sort of the classic werewolf movie, but, you know, the movie's effect is really kind of hindered the moment you see that terrible, like, transformation sequence where suddenly, I mean, it was a big deal for the time, but where suddenly he grew all this hair and stuff, and it doesn't look very convincing. In this movie, they just threw all that out. They knew they had a low budget, they knew they weren't going to be able to afford that much effects, so they just said, let's make this about psyche. You know, about this woman's psyche. And in a way, Cat People is talking about so much more than just, like, horror genre stuff. It's talking about, you know, our psychology, and the way that we deal with stories, and the difference between, like, mind and soul. And is she really cursed? Is it, I mean, maybe she's cursed in a way that turns her into a cat, but that's not even what we're looking at. We're looking at, is the ideas that she's been fed about herself really cursed her? Made it so that she could never be with a man. It's an interesting, very, very, in some ways, haunting in itself take on this idea. And it all comes across greatly, partly because of Jacques Tourneur's direction. Jacques Tourneur was a director who started out in these Val Lewton films and these B films, and eventually went on to make Out of the Past, which is one of the great noir classics of all time. His understanding of light and shadow is integral to how great this movie is. The shadows, the frame, the picture is all beautifully shot in black and white, in the sense that it's dark, and it's got this sense of, it's got this total beauty to it. They knew that they couldn't afford a lot of lighting. Part of it was out of necessity. They couldn't afford too much lighting. Lighting is expensive. These are B movies. So they kept it dimly lit, but they allowed the shadows to actually tell stories in and of themselves, and the main focus of the horror. Of all of the early 40s and 30s horror films that I have seen up to this date, Cat People is the one that actually, in a way, could cause you to feel somewhat unsettled while watching it, in the sense that you may actually feel scared. Like I said, the reason for that is that the type of fear that Cat People is trying to induce is not the fear of some sort of makeup job, like Frankenstein or the Wolfman, but the fear of stuff that we typically fear, like being alone, being followed, being stalked, being isolated. That is the type of fear that Cat People preys on, and it does it wonderfully. It also tries, as I said, to make an analysis of that psychology, which is also quite brilliant. Another thing that makes Cat People great are the performances, and you wouldn't think you'd say that with all these B actors, but it's really a testament to the quality of the actors in the studio system that Cat People is so good. And even Kent Smith, who has a name that's super generic, is quite a decent actor as Oliver Reed. He plays that classic American guy that he's supposed to so well. Jane Randolph, who plays the other woman in the relationship, is great. And of course, Simone Simon is fantastic as Irena, the Catwoman. I mean, she actually has a fantastic performance in this movie, multi-layered. This is not a movie in which you hate the monster. This is a movie in which you completely pity her. Pity what she's going through, in a way. And you're afraid of what she'll become, but you also pity what's happening to her. She's actually like the heroine of the movie. And then you have some great actors like Tom Conway, who just comes in, and he's that classic smooth British B guy. He played the Falcon in a series of adventure films. He played Simon Templar, the Saint on Radio. You know, he's that classic smooth British character actor, perfect for the role of the psychologist. Overall, I can't recommend Cat People enough. If you think that you don't like classic horror films or black and white horror movies, take a look at Cat People. It's an example of what could be done in the studio system with a classic black and white horror film. We're going to have another review today, and I also got a chance for the first time this year to watch the sequel, Curse of the Cat People. And we're going to do that really quickly because I just want to make some points about that. Curse of the Cat People was made in 1944, after Tourneur had actually left Luton's unit. We're going to talk more about Jacques Tourneur and Val Luton in a couple more reviews down the line. But Curse of the Cat People is a very interesting movie. Just like Cat People, it was given a terrible title. It's co-directed by Robert Wise, who actually went on to direct a lot of grade A work, and he was a B unit director here, and it was his first ever film. And the movie really actually focuses on a little girl and sort of her dealing with life, and she's very imaginative. She doesn't play as much with the other children, and she also is, you know, she finds this friend, and the friend, of course, is like the spirit of Irena, the Catwoman. Curse of the Cat People, of course, was given a terrible title. Again, Luton was stuck with a terrible title, but in this case, he actually made something completely different. Curse of the Cat People is not a horror movie. It's a look at sort of a child and really what a child deals with in terms of the imagination, and also about a child sort of dealing with divorce, dealing with a parent who has had a previous wife, dealing with someone that she never knew, but that had been very integral to her father's life and had really cursed him. That's what the Curse of the Cat People is. The Curse of the Cat People is the effect that Irena has on the generations afterwards, and the effect that she has on Oliver, and the effect that she has on the girl. The thing about the movie is, it has a lot of great points in it, and some really beautiful sequences. Again, you'd swear that, it's a grade A director working here. It's got some beautiful sequences in it. There's a little bit of chills in this movie, but actually the horror subplot of Curse of the Cat People, which is actually sort of a subplot, isn't really like a horror movie at all. It does relate into the inner plot ideas about what the girl's going through, but it does feel a little bit disjointed, like as if they had to throw that in there just to make sure that the movie wasn't a complete, drama as opposed to a horror film. But it definitely still comes off as just a drama, a fantasy about this girl and what she's dealing with. And in a lot of ways it's brilliant, but in some ways it feels like either things don't get fleshed out enough or certain sequences take a little longer. I give Cat People 5 stars because it's an essential, and I give Curse of the Cat People 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's a very good movie. You wouldn't expect it to be what it is. It just doesn't necessarily reach the heights of its predecessor. Both movies are fantastic. Be sure to join me next time when I look at I Walked with a Zombie, coming up next on my film reviews. And also be sure to click the link below to the blog, Brennan the Movies at blogspot.com. Here's looking at you, kid.